He didn't ask her to sit down first. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't reach for her hand. He stood in the center of the living room they had shared for 9 years, the room with the fireplace she had chosen, the bookshelves he had built himself the summer before his company went public. And he told her plainly, with the same flat efficiency he used in boardrooms, that Vanessa was pregnant, that it was his, and that he wanted a divorce. Lillian heard the words. She understood them. But for several seconds, she simply stood there in her bare feet on the cold marble floor and said nothing at all, because some part of her brain was still waiting for the sentence to make sense. It never did. That moment, the stillness before everything broke, was the last quiet she would know for a very long time. The Caldwell estate sat on 4 acres of landscaped hillside above Marin County, overlooking the bay on clear days and the fog on most others. It had been featured twice in architectural magazines, once for the design, once for what the caption called a rare marriage of ambition and warmth. Lillian had laughed at that when she read it, because the warmth in that house had been almost entirely her doing. The throw blankets on the sofas, the herb garden outside the kitchen window, the framed photographs along the staircase wall, arranged not chronologically but emotionally, the ones that made you feel something placed where your eye naturally landed first. Ethan had barely noticed any of it. He noticed results. He noticed quarterly projections and server capacity and the particular silence of a conference call right before a negotiation shifted in his favor. He was good at the large shapes of things and blind to almost everything else. They had met 19 years ago, during their junior year at Stanford. Lillian had been sitting outside the engineering library with a sketchbook open on her knees, drawing the shadows that the eucalyptus trees threw across the pathway in the late afternoon light. Ethan had stopped because he'd thought she was sketching the building's structural lines for an architecture class. When he realized she was just drawing shadows because she found them beautiful, something in him went quiet and curious in a way he hadn't expected. He was not a man who typically stopped moving. They dated for 3 years before he proposed. She said yes because she loved him, and because she believed, with the particular certainty of someone still young enough to trust her instincts completely, that this was a man worth building a life beside. Not for his ambition. That was always a little frightening, even to her. But for the rare moments when the ambition dropped away entirely and he was just a person, tired and funny and real. Those moments became rarer as the years went on. Caldwell Technologies grew from a 2-person startup running out of a rented Palo Alto office into one of the most aggressive mid-size infrastructure companies in the country. Ethan hired hard and fired faster. He worked 18-hour days that stretched into years. He won awards and gave speeches and flew to speaking engagements in cities he never really saw because he was always already thinking about the next flight home and the next problem waiting on his desk. Lillian stayed. She had set aside her own ambitions carefully, the way you set aside something breakable, with full intention of returning to it. She had studied digital art and visual design at Stanford. She was talented in a way her professors had said was rare, meaning commercially real, not just technically competent. But Ethan's company needed things, and she was good at supplying them. She became the quiet engine behind the public-facing identity of Caldwell Technologies, the brand design, the investor presentation aesthetics, the visual language that made the company feel trustworthy and forward-thinking rather than just aggressive. She never held a formal title. She never drew a salary. It was simply what you did when you were building something together, and she had believed for a long time that they were. The one thing they had not been able to build together was a family. They had tried for 6 years. 3 pregnancies, none of them carried past the first trimester. The fertility specialist had used careful clinical language to describe what was happening, terms that translated roughly into the phrase not impossible, but increasingly unlikely, which was the kind of sentence that lodged in the chest and didn't come out clean. Ethan had not handled it well. He had handled it the way he handled most things that resisted his control, by throwing money at specialists, demanding second opinions, researching procedures with the same cold focus he applied to product development. He had treated it like a problem with a solution, and when the solution kept failing, he had grown distant in a way that was hard to name but impossible to miss. Lillian had handled it quietly. She grieved each loss the way women are often expected to grieve, privately, functionally, without making it too difficult for the people around her. She cried in the shower. She kept her appointments. She came downstairs in the morning and made coffee and asked Ethan how his calls had gone. She did not know, during those years of quiet grief, that Ethan had already begun looking elsewhere for something she couldn't give him. Vanessa Reed had joined Caldwell Technologies 3 years ago as a director of strategic partnerships, poached from a competitor with a salary that made the HR department raise their eyebrows. She was 31 years old with a background in venture development and a reputation for closing deals that more cautious people wouldn't touch. She was sharp and energetic, and she laughed at Ethan's jokes in a way that suggested she found them genuinely funny rather than strategically funny, which was rarer than it should have been at his level. Lillian had met her once at a company dinner. She had shaken her hand and said something polite about the work she'd heard Vanessa was doing in the Pacific Rim partnerships. Vanessa had smiled with the warmth of someone who is excellent at smiling warmly and said she was a huge admirer of the Caldwell brand voice. Lillian had thanked her and moved on because she'd shaken hands with dozens of Ethan's executives over the years, and there was no reason to linger. She would think about that handshake later. The ordinary, forgettable normalcy of it. The affair had been ongoing for 14 months before Ethan told Lillian the truth. 14 months of business trips that ran a day longer than they needed to, of text messages he turned face down on the table, of a subtle but unmistakable shift in his energy when he came home. Not guilty exactly, but somewhere just past present tense. Lillian had noticed things. She was not a foolish woman, but she had chosen, in the way that people sometimes choose, to leave certain doors closed a little longer. Because what you find when you open them cannot be unfound. The door opened on a Tuesday evening in March. She had come home from a late dinner with a friend to find Ethan in the living room. He was still in his work clothes, jacket off, tie loosened, sitting on the edge of the armchair rather than in it, perched, as if he'd been sitting there for some time, rehearsing something. She set her bag down on the console table and said something ordinary, something about traffic on the bridge, and Ethan said her name in a tone she had never heard from him before. Not angry, not tender, something else, stripped down. "There's something I have to tell you," he said. She sat down across from him. She didn't know why, but she took her shoes off first. Her feet found the cold floor, and she looked at him and said, "Okay." And he told her. He had been seeing someone. It had become serious. She was pregnant. He was certain it was his. He didn't use the word love, which Lillian noted, and never stopped noting. He said things like, "She's important to me," and "I want to do the right thing," and "I think it's best if we're honest with ourselves about where we are." The language of a business memo. The language of a man who had prepared what he was going to say and was now simply delivering it. Lillian listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, the room was very quiet. "How long?" she said. "Lillian, how long, Ethan?" A pause. "Over a year." She absorbed that. The number was worse than she'd expected, which meant some part of her had been expecting something. She pressed her palms flat on her thighs and breathed. "Does she work for you?" He hesitated just a fraction of a second too long. "Vanessa Reed," Lillian said. Not a question. His expression shifted. A brief collapse of something, surprise or shame or both. "Yes." She nodded slowly. The name landed differently than she'd imagined it might in this kind of moment. Not like a knife, more like a key turning in a lock that had already been open for a while without her realizing it. "I think," Ethan said carefully, "it would be better for both of us to—" "Don't." Her voice was quiet but very clear. "Don't tell me what would be better for me right now. Give me a minute." He waited. She sat with it. She looked at the fireplace she had chosen and the bookshelves he had built, and the photograph on the mantel from their trip to Iceland 4 years ago, where they had stood on black volcanic rock with the green flicker of the northern lights overhead, and she had leaned her head against his shoulder and thought she would remember that moment forever as a perfect one. She had remembered it correctly. She had just not understood what it was the last picture of. The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours and ended the way those conversations always end. Not with resolution, but with exhaustion, with both people having said most of what needed saying and neither one having been fully heard. Ethan wanted a divorce. He said it more than once, in slightly different words each time, the way he repeated things in negotiations when he wanted the other party to understand that this was not a position he was entertaining alternatives to. He spoke about a settlement, He had a number in mind, a significant number, he said, which was intended to be generous. He said the word generous twice, with what sounded to Lillian like genuine belief in his own fairness. She told him she would not be discussing numbers tonight. Lillian, I understand this is hard. You destroyed our marriage, she said, and you're sitting here talking to me about numbers. Tonight is not for numbers. He had the grace at least to go quiet after that. What she did not do, what surprised him, she would later sense, was cry. She felt the pressure of it behind her eyes, the full weight of a decade and 3 lost pregnancies and 14 months of his absence arriving all at once. But she did not cry in front of him, not because she was performing strength, but because she understood, with a clarity that felt almost frightening, that there was no version of this room in which her tears would change anything. Ethan had made a decision. He had made it a long time ago, probably, and she was only now being informed of it. What she needed was not this room. Over the following 2 weeks, the estate became a kind of Cold War geography. They moved through it on separate schedules, careful and polite in the way that people are when they are trying not to have the screaming fight that is pressurizing the air between them. Ethan worked later and came home after she had gone to bed. Lillian spent her evenings in the studio room off the kitchen that had, over the years, slowly filled with the quiet wreckage of her abandoned art practice. Tablets she hadn't opened, styluses still in their packaging, half-finished sketches and folders she hadn't looked at in 3 years. One night she sat down in front of the drafting table and opened one of the folders. The sketches inside were from early in the marriage. Quick studies, mostly. Faces on the BART, light through cafe windows, the particular way fog moved through the Golden Gate at morning. They were good. She had forgotten that they were good. She sat with them for a long time. She didn't draw anything that night. She just sat. The legal process began the way it always does. Slowly, and then very fast. Ethan's attorney submitted preliminary settlement terms in early April. The terms were what Lillian had expected, a lump sum structured as a clean break rather than ongoing support, with a clause describing it as a reflection of the collaborative nature of the marriage. There was no mention of her contributions to the company's brand architecture. No mention of the investor presentation she had designed from scratch, the identity guidelines that still governed every public-facing communication Caldwell Technologies produced, the years of unpaid strategic work she had performed for a company now valued at north of $800 million. The number looked significant in isolation. In context, it was an insult. Lillian spent 2 days going through the terms alone, taking notes in the margins in red pen, before she called her college friend Dana Reyes, who had spent the last 15 years building one of the more effective divorce litigation practices in San Francisco. They met for coffee at a small place in the Ferry Building on a Friday morning, and Lillian laid the documents on the table and said simply, "Tell me what this is actually worth." Dana looked through the papers with the focused quiet of someone doing triage. When she finished, she set them down, wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, and looked at Lillian with an expression that was frank and not unkind. "On its own, the number looks decent," Dana said. "In the context of what you actually contributed to that company over the past 9 years, it's about a third of what I'd argue you're owed." Lillian's jaw tightened slightly. "Tell me what a third means." "It means there's a real case here, a significant one. How documented is the work you did for the brand?" "I still have all the files, version histories, correspondence, presentations. I can pull up email chains going back to the 2nd year of the company." Dana nodded slowly. "Good. Here's the question I need you to sit with before we go any further. Do you want to settle or do you want to fight? What's the difference in plain terms? Settlement is faster, quieter, and certain. You walk away with more than his lawyers are offering, but you accept a ceiling. Fighting means depositions, discovery, potentially a year or more of litigation, public exposure of financial records, and a very uncomfortable conversation for Ethan about the nature of your contributions to a company he currently tells the world he built alone." Dana paused. "The second path is not pleasant, but I've won it before." Lillian looked out the window at the waterfront. A ferry was coming in through the fog, its running lights still on despite the morning. She thought about the word generous and the way Ethan had used it. "I want what I'm owed," she said. "Not a penny more, not a penny less." Dana picked up her pen. "Imatan." Ethan announced the pregnancy publicly in May, which Lillian learned about from a technology news website rather than from him directly. The article featured a photo taken at some kind of industry event. Ethan in a well-cut charcoal suit, Vanessa beside him in something red, his hand at the small of her back. The caption described her as his partner, which was the carefully chosen word of a publicist, and mentioned that the couple was expecting their first child. The comments section, which Lillian made the mistake of reading, ran roughly 60% congratulatory and 40% speculation about the sudden end of his marriage. She closed the browser. What she felt in that moment was not what she had expected. She had expected the jagged kind of pain, the sharp, specific hurt of seeing what replaced you. What she felt instead was something older and heavier, a kind of tired grief, not for Ethan specifically, but for the version of the future she had been quietly, persistently imagining for a decade. The children they hadn't been able to have, the life she had organized herself around the hope of. That version of the future was fully gone now. She needed to understand that clearly without softening it. She understood it that evening, alone in the condo she had moved into 2 weeks earlier. It was a serviceable place, clean, well-located, utterly without character. And she hated it with a low-level intensity she recognized as useful. Hate for a place meant the energy to leave it. She opened the tablet she hadn't used in 3 years. It took her 20 minutes to relearn the software interface. Her hands felt unfamiliar with the stylus at first, clumsy in a way that irritated her. She worked through the irritation. She didn't make anything that night. She just practiced. Shadow and light. Lines that went nowhere. Getting reacquainted with the tool. But she came back to it the next night, and the night after that. The legal proceedings moved forward through the summer with the grinding slowness of a process designed to exhaust both parties before they reached the finish. Dana was precise and methodical, and when the moment called for it, genuinely intimidating. She requested documentation going back 7 years. She retained a brand evaluation expert who spent 6 weeks analyzing Lillian's documented contributions to Caldwell Technologies' identity and came back with a number that made Ethan's attorneys request a 2-week continuance. Lillian heard about the continuance from Dana on a Wednesday afternoon phone call, and when she hung up, she sat for a moment at her kitchen table and felt something she hadn't felt since the estate. A small, specific satisfaction, not joy, not vindication, exactly. More like the sensation of a door clicking properly into its frame after years of hanging wrong. Ethan called her that evening. She didn't answer. He left a voicemail that she listened to once, standing in the kitchen, and then deleted. He had said her name in that stripped-down tone again, the one from the night in the living room, and had said he wanted to talk, just talk, and that things were getting complicated and he thought maybe they could find a way to resolve this that worked for both of them. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Not quite fear, adjacent to it. She did not call back. She went to the table and opened the tablet instead. By late July, she had built something, not a collection yet, not in any coherent sense, but 40-odd pieces, some finished, some half-formed, all of them circling the same territory. Loss rendered in abstracted form, fractured geometry, color gradients that moved through warmth into something colder, shapes that suggested human figures without quite being them. There was anger in some of the work, and something sadder and stranger in others. She had not been trying to make anything meaningful. She had been trying to survive the nights, and this was what survival had produced. She showed the work to no one. One evening in early August, she was sitting at the drafting table when her phone rang. The name on the screen was Marcus Webb, a former colleague from her Stanford days who had gone on to run one of the more respected digital art platforms on the West Coast. They'd stayed loosely in touch over the years, catching up over email every 18 months or so. She answered. Marcus wanted to know if she was still working because he'd heard through a mutual contact that she was in a difficult period and he wanted to check in, but also, he admitted with the slight awkwardness of someone trying to be professional and personal at the same time, he was putting together a curated showcase in the fall, and the themes were running toward loss, Lillian said. A pause. Yeah, more or less. I have work, she said. I don't know if it's ready. Would you be willing to show me what you have? She looked at the files on her screen. 43 pieces. None of them named. She had not titled a single one because she hadn't thought she was making something that needed titles. I'll send you 12 of them, she said. Don't read anything about my personal situation first. Just look at the work. Of course. She sent the files that night and went to bed without reading anything or checking her phone, which was the most disciplined act of the entire year. The divorce was finalized in late September, with terms substantially better than Ethan's initial offer, and substantially worse than what a full trial might have produced. It was a number that lived in the space between insult and justice, which was where most settlements lived. Dana called it a strong result. Lillian called it the beginning. She signed the papers on a Tuesday morning, alone in Dana's office with the fog pressing gray against the windows and a cup of coffee going cold on the table beside her. She read everything twice before she signed. She always read everything twice. When the last signature was done, Dana pushed back from the desk and said, "How are you feeling?" Lillian thought about the question seriously rather than answering it reflexively. "Like someone who has just gotten out of a very bad building," she said. "I can feel the open air. I don't quite know what to do with it yet." Dana smiled, not professionally but genuinely. "You will." Outside, Lillian stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let the fog settle on her face. The city moved around her, cars, pedestrians, the distant sound of a cable car bell. She had lived here for most of her adult life, and it had never felt quite like this. Not liberated? That was too clean a word. More like standing on ground that was entirely hers. She had a meeting with Marcus Webb in 2 hours. She turned and walked toward it. Marcus had not waited to read about her situation. He had, to his credit, done exactly what she'd asked and looked at the work cold, without context. "The first piece I opened," he told her when they sat down, "I thought there had been some kind of sorting error. I thought I'd opened the wrong folder." He paused. "The second piece I thought, whoever this is, she's been through something serious. The third piece I thought, I need to know who this is immediately." Lillian looked at him levelly. "It's not ready. The rawness is part of what makes it work." "That's not the same as ready." He acknowledged this. They went back and forth for an hour, not arguing exactly, but negotiating the difference between what the work was and what it needed to be. Lillian was precise about her concerns. 3 of the pieces were technically incomplete. 2 others were too legible, too on the surface. They needed more pressure before they would hold. Marcus wanted to move fast because the showcase window was closing. She told him she needed 6 weeks minimum and no extensions would be necessary if he stopped interrupting her. He laughed, which she hadn't expected. "I've been trying to get work with this kind of feeling into the showcase for 8 months, he said. 6 weeks is completely fine." "I'll be anonymous," she said. "I want the work seen before the biography." "That's unconventional." "I know." "Also," he said, "probably right for this work. The biography would flatten it." They agreed on terms, and Lillian walked out into the thin October sunlight with something she hadn't had for most of the year, something to build toward. She went home and opened the tablet. The 6 weeks that followed were the hardest and the most alive she had felt in a long time. She worked every night and most mornings, sometimes stopping only when the light through the windows had gone from dark to gray, and she understood that what she'd taken for a long evening was actually the entire night. She revised the pieces Marcus had flagged and went further than he'd asked. She named all 43 of them, which required sitting with each piece long enough to understand what it was actually saying, not what she had intended it to say, but what it said on its own. There was a difference sometimes. Art was like that. She ate badly during those weeks and slept in inconsistent blocks, and drank more coffee than was probably wise, and called her mother twice, brief calls in which she said she was fine and meant something more complicated. Her mother, who was sharp in the way that mothers of daughters who have survived hard things sometimes are, said, "Are you working?" And when Lillian said yes, her mother said, "Good, keep going." She did. The collection, when it was finished, was called What Remains? 47 pieces. 4 new ones had appeared in the final 2 weeks, almost without her noticing. Abstract, emotionally precise, built around the visual language of fracture and the slow return of color. Some of the pieces were very quiet and some of them were not quiet at all, but they held together as a body of work in the way that things hold together when they've been built by someone who understood the material from the inside. Marcus uploaded the first piece to the platform on a Friday evening and sent her a text that said simply, "It's up. Don't look at the numbers tonight. Look tomorrow." She looked tonight. The numbers were not the kind of numbers she had expected from a first night, not even close. She put the phone face down on the table and sat in her kitchen, in her serviceable condo she hated, and stared at the wall and felt something move through her chest that was complicated enough that it took her a while to identify it. She had spent 10 years building something for someone else. She was 39 years old, and she had just made the first thing that was entirely, uncomplicatedly hers. She did not allow herself to cry about it until the next morning when the numbers were even higher. The numbers kept climbing. By the end of the first weekend, What Remains had accumulated more engagement than Marcus's platform typically saw in a full month from established artists. He called her Sunday afternoon, and she could hear in his voice the particular energy of someone trying to sound professionally calm about something that was not professionally calm. 42,000 unique visitors, he said. Piece 7 has been shared over 800 times in the last 18 hours alone. The comments are... He paused. Have you been reading the comments? Some of them. What are you thinking? Lillian was sitting at the kitchen table with her second coffee of the morning, still in the clothes she'd slept in, which was a thing she'd been doing more often since the divorce. Not out of depression exactly, but out of a kind of loosened relationship with the small social rituals that had governed her days for a decade. Nobody was coming home. There was no reason to be dressed by 9. I'm thinking I underestimated how many people have felt this particular thing, she said. Which thing? She thought about Piece 7, a large format digital composition built around the image of a fractured geometric form, slowly being rebuilt from its own fragments, the color moving through cold gray-blue into something warmer but still uncertain at the edges. She had made it during the worst week of October, when the insomnia was at its peak, and she'd spent 3 nights in a row working until her hands cramped. The thing where you lose something and have to figure out what you are without it, she said. I think a lot of people are living inside that question. Marcus was quiet for a moment. There's a collector in New York who's asking about acquisition rights on 4 of the pieces, and an editor from Composite magazine reached out about an interview. No interview yet, not until the collection has been seen on its own terms for a while longer. You keep saying things like that, and I keep thinking you've done this before. I haven't, she said. I've just watched Ethan do enough press to understand what happens when the story gets ahead of the work. She said his name without thinking, and then noticed that she'd said it without flinching, which was new. Progress came in forms you didn't always recognize. She had not spoken to Ethan since the day she signed the divorce papers. He had sent 2 emails in October, both of them carefully worded, both of them ostensibly about administrative matters related to the estate and the few remaining financial entanglements their attorneys hadn't fully untangled, but both carrying something underneath the administrative language that she chose not to examine too closely. She replied to the logistical content of each email through Dana's office and did not respond to the undertone. The estate had sold in November. She had not been present for the closing. Dana had handled it and forwarded her a brief summary and the final figures, and Lillian had read them on her phone while waiting for a coffee order and felt nothing particular. Or not nothing. A small flicker of something, a recognition of finality, but nothing that required her to stop moving. She kept moving. The settlement funds had arrived in October, and she had put a significant portion of them into a money market account, and not thought about it beyond that because she had not been ready to think about money as a tool rather than a wound. By December, she was ready. She spent 3 evenings that month at a long table in the Ferry Building with a financial advisor named Grace Okonkwo, who had been recommended to her by Dana and who had the useful quality of explaining things without condescension. They went through the settlement figure together, line by line. They talked about what Lillian wanted, not the vague wanting of someone who's been told to invest wisely, but the specific wanting of someone who had spent years watching how capital actually moved and had formed real opinions about it. You know more about this than most people who walk in here, Grace said during the second meeting. I spent a decade adjacent to a tech founder, Lillian said. You pick things up. What did you pick up about where not to put money? Anything where the story is more polished than the fundamentals. Anything where the people running it can't explain their risk exposure in plain sentences. And anything that depends on Ethan Caldwell continuing to make good decisions. Grace smiled. That last one won't be hard to avoid. Lillian's index finger traced the edge of the paper in front of her. I want a portion in something I understand and a portion in something I'm still learning. I don't want to be passive about this. What do you understand? Brand architecture, digital platforms, content infrastructure. She paused. I also want to put a piece into an emerging artist fund. Not for the return. The return is probably modest, but because I want a stake in the ecosystem I'm now operating in. Grace wrote something down. That's an unusual priority for a first-time independent investor. I know. Do it anyway. Atem. What Remains ran on Marcus's platform through the end of November, and in that time it had attracted the kind of attention that has a texture to it. Not just numbers, but weight, presence, the feeling of a thing that had entered the conversation and changed it slightly. The composite interview request was still on the table, and two others had joined it. A gallery in Los Angeles had reached out about a physical installation show. A product licensing inquiry had come in from a stationery company, which she declined without much deliberation, and a more interesting inquiry had come from a digital content platform that was building a curated creator program and wanted her to be part of the founding cohort. She read that last email 3 times. The platform was called Meridian. It was 18 months old, which in platform terms meant it was past the initial chaos, but not yet calcified into the patterns that eventually made most platforms predictable and safe and slightly lifeless. It was backed by serious money. She recognized 2 of the investors from the tech world she had spent a decade inside. And its model was unusual. Rather than maximizing content volume, it curated a small roster of creators with genuine artistic credibility and gave them resources, visibility, and revenue sharing in exchange for exclusive digital distribution. She replied to the email and asked for a call. The call was with a woman named Sophia Tanaka, Meridian's head of creator partnerships, who had the quality Lillian had come to value above almost all others in professional conversations. She said what she actually meant. They talked for an hour and a half. Lillian asked about the revenue architecture, the ownership terms, the creative control provisions, and the exit clauses. And Sophia answered each question without deflecting and pushed back once, clearly, when Lillian raised a concern about exclusivity scope that Sophia thought was based on a misreading of the contract language. You're right, actually, Lillian said, after rereading the relevant clause during the call. I misread it. Most people in this conversation try to win the point anyway, Sophia said. That sounds exhausting. It is. They agreed on terms by the end of January. Lillian would bring an expanded collection, a sequel to What Remains, though she didn't call it that yet, didn't call it anything, to Meridian in the spring, with physical installation rights retained for gallery use. She would receive a platform stipend that amounted to more than she had ever drawn as a salary in her life, which she tried not to think about too directly because it produced an emotion she wasn't ready to name. She was building something. She could feel the shape of it. She talked to her mother more that winter. Not the brief functional calls of the hard months, longer calls, sometimes an hour, wandering through subjects the way their conversations had wandered when Lillian was in her 20s and her mother was the person she thought things out loud with. Her mother, Vera Brooks, was 71 and lived in Portland, and had maintained through the entire divorce a kind of steady, unsentimental supportiveness that Lillian had found more sustaining than any amount of expressed outrage on her behalf would have been. Vera had never loved Ethan the way some mothers love their daughters' husbands, warmly but critically, alert to the specific ways he was and wasn't good for her. She had not said "I told you so" at any point, because she was not that kind of mother. What she had said in the early weeks was, "The years you gave that marriage weren't wasted years. You were living your life. Don't rewrite them into something they weren't." Lillian had thought about that a great deal. "Are you actually eating?" Vera asked on a January call. Define eating. Food, regular intervals, things that didn't come in a paper bag. Mostly yes, occasionally no. A pause. "I've been working a lot. I forget." "You always forgot when you were working. When you were 18, you spent 3 days drawing that series of the Old Harbor, and I had to physically bring food into your room." "I remember that series. It wasn't very good." "The Harbor series was lovely. You were your own harshest critic even then." Vera's voice shifted slightly. "How's the new work?" "It's different from What Remains. Less raw. More structured, I think. But I'm not sure structure is the right word. More like, I'm not just reacting anymore. I'm building toward something. What are you building toward? Lillian thought about it. I don't know yet, but it feels deliberate. That's enough, Vera said. Deliberate is enough. Gun. Dana called in February with an update on a secondary legal matter, a small remaining dispute about intellectual property attribution related to some of Lillian's early brand work for Caldwell Technologies, which had come up as a corollary to the divorce proceedings. It was not a large amount of money, but it was a matter of record, of having the documentation formally acknowledge what she had done. Ethan's team is going to push back on the attribution language, Dana said, not because they have a legal leg to stand on, but because he doesn't like the narrative it creates. What narrative is that? That a significant portion of the visual identity of Caldwell Technologies was created by his ex-wife, who received no formal credit for it. Lillian let that sit for a moment. How long will it take to resolve? 3 to 4 months if they cooperate, 6 to 8 if they decide to be difficult. Let them be as difficult as they want, Lillian said. I have documentation going back to year 2 of that company. I have version files, correspondence, time-stamped drafts. We will win this. I know we'll win. I want to make sure you're prepared for how uncomfortable it gets before we do. I've been uncomfortable for about a year now, Lillian said. I've learned to work through it. Dana laughed, a short, real sound. You've changed. I was always like this. I just wasn't using it. The question of what she actually was, professionally, publicly, became more pressing as the spring approached and the Meridian launch grew closer. She was an artist, clearly, but that was not the whole of it. The investment position she was building with grace, small but deliberate, were pushing her into the territory of an entrepreneur as well. And the platform partnership itself carried with it a dimension of brand architecture that was, she recognized with some irony, the same work she had done for Ethan's company for 9 years, now applied to her own enterprise. She was a brand, whether she wanted to think about it in those terms or not. Her work was a public face, and the public face was attached to a story, and the story was rapidly becoming something people found compelling. She spent an afternoon in March going through the accumulated press requests, 7 at this point, and writing a list of what she would and would not say in an interview. Not a media training list, nothing that polished, a personal list for her own clarity. Things she refused to let become part of the public narrative. Specific details about the marriage, Ethan's name, the settlement figure. Things she was willing to say. How the work began, what it cost her to make it, what she hoped people found in it. The composite interview, when it happened in late March, ran to 4,000 words. The journalist, a careful, smart woman named Priya Mehta, who had been covering the digital art world for 7 years, had clearly done thorough research and just as clearly understood the shape of the story she was not being asked to write. She didn't push on the personal territory. She asked instead about the visual vocabulary of what remains, about the decision to remain anonymous during the first run of the collection, about what Lillian thought art could do that other forms of communication couldn't. Art can say the true thing in a way that doesn't require the receiver to defend against it, Lillian said. When you tell someone a fact about grief or betrayal or the process of rebuilding after loss, there's a part of the human brain that immediately starts categorizing and evaluating, filing it away, deciding how to feel about it. When you make an image or a piece of music or a story, you can sometimes get underneath that mechanism. You can put the thing directly into the body before the mind has a chance to decide what to do with it. Priya had looked up from her notes. Is that what happened with Piece 7 specifically? Because the response to that one has been extraordinary. Piece 7 took me 1 night to make, after 3 nights of not sleeping, Lillian said. It's the most honest thing I've produced in 20 years of working. I think people can feel that it was made under real conditions. Do you worry about what comes next? Whether the work that comes from a more stable place can have the same force? It was a good question, a real one. Lillian had been asking it herself. I worry about it every day, she said, but I think it's a false premise, a little. Stability and force aren't opposites. What matters is whether the work is made honestly, from inside the actual experience of being alive. My actual experience right now is different from 6 months ago. Harder in some ways more open. I'm interested in what that produces. The piece ran in April, the week the Meridian collection launched. The timing was not intentional, but it worked the way good timing always does, as if it had been planned by someone who understood the dynamics better than everyone involved. The Meridian launch was quieter than the What Remains debut, in the sense that it was curated rather than organic, a controlled release, properly staged, with the infrastructure of a real platform behind it, rather than the raw word-of-mouth velocity of the first collection. But the numbers, when they came in, were not quieter. The composite interview had done what interviews do when the work is already known. It provided the biography to the art that people had already been moved by, and the combination produced a kind of doubled recognition in the audience. They had felt the work before they knew who made it. Now they knew who made it. Lillian spent the launch night at Marcus's office, which she had not expected. He had called in the afternoon and asked if she wanted company, and she had said yes before she thought about it, which was itself a change. For most of the past year, she had defaulted to solitude, finding it easier and less complicated than navigating other people's responses to her situation. Marcus had been careful with her from the beginning, interested without being intrusive, professionally genuine without performing it. And she had come to trust his company the way you trust the company of someone who has never once asked you to explain yourself. They sat in front of 2 laptops and watched the numbers move and drank mediocre wine from a bottle someone had left in the office kitchen. "There's an inquiry from a gallery in Chicago," Marcus said, reading from his screen. "Already? Physical installation, 6 weeks, summer slot." He looked up. "That's a real show, Lillian. That's not a pop-up." She looked at her own screen. The comments on the new collection were coming in faster than she could read them, which she had learned by now to experience not as pressure, but as information, evidence that the work had found its audience. She read a few. A woman who had survived a divorce after 30 years of marriage. A man who had lost a business he'd built from nothing. A girl in college who had not yet experienced the specific losses the work depicted, but who said she felt, reading it, as if she were being prepared for something real. That last one made her sit back in her chair for a moment. "The Chicago Gallery," she said. "What's their timeline for a decision?" "They want an answer by end of the month. Tell them I need to see their space first. I won't commit to an installation without understanding the physical context. I've made that mistake before." She paused. "Actually, I've never made that mistake before. But I've watched other people make it, and it always ends badly." Marcus nodded. "I'll arrange a visit." She looked at the numbers a little longer, then deliberately closed the laptop. Watching the numbers accumulate in real time was a thing she had decided somewhere around the 2nd month of the Meridian partnership was not good for her. The numbers were useful as periodic data. As a continuous feed, they produced a particular kind of anxiety she recognized from the years she had spent adjacent to Ethan's world. The anxiety of a person whose sense of stability has become hitched to metrics that fluctuate beyond their control. She did not want to be that person. "You closed the laptop," Marcus said, with the slight note of someone who has been observing a pattern. "I did." "I've never seen a creator close the laptop on launch night." "It's still going to be what it is in the morning," she said, "and I'd rather wake up to it than watch it happen minute by minute." He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she had noticed before and deliberately not examined. "That's one of the more psychologically healthy things I've ever heard a person say about their own work." "I've had a lot of time to think about what I don't want to be," she said. It came out more plainly than she'd intended. Honest without performance, which was the mode she'd been operating in for a while now and hadn't entirely gotten used to. They sat with that for a moment, the comfortable and slightly charged silence of 2 people who understood each other well enough to let things settle without filling them. In May, 2 things happened in the same week that she would later identify as the point where the accumulation of small changes became something larger and visible. The first was that Grace called to tell her that the stake she'd taken in a mid-sized digital content infrastructure company, a deliberate research-heavy position she'd established in January based on her own reading of where the platform economy was moving, had appreciated significantly following an announcement of an acquisition deal. The gain was not life-changing in isolation, but it was real, and it was the result of her own judgment applied to her own analysis. That was the part that mattered. "You called this one," Grace said. "The timing was good, but the thesis was yours." "The thesis was obvious to anyone who understood how content licensing works," Lillian said. but she let herself feel the quiet satisfaction of it anyway. The second thing was a call from a woman named Helen Farrow, who ran a small but well-regarded venture fund called Unravel that focused specifically on companies operating at the intersection of creative industries and technology platforms. Helen had seen the composite interview and had spent 2 weeks looking at Lillian's investment activity through the public disclosures she was required to file as part of the Meridian partnership. She wanted to have lunch. They met at a restaurant in the financial district on a Thursday afternoon. Helen was in her mid-50s, compact, fast-talking, with the particular alertness of someone who processed information at high speed and filtered it ruthlessly. She had spent the first 15 years of her career in corporate law before moving into venture and had never, she said, looked back at the law years with anything but gratitude and relief. "You've made 3 investments in the past 5 months," Helen said, over the kind of meal that was clearly meant to be eaten quickly and talked through. Each one in a space that most retail investors haven't figured out yet, each one with a clear thesis and disciplined sizing. "I'm being careful," Lillian said. "I'm not overextending into spaces I don't understand." "That's not what impresses me. What impresses me is that all 3 are in the same underlying story. You have a theory about where creative platform economics are going, and you're investing the theory coherently." Helen looked at her directly. "Where did you develop the theory?" Lillian considered how to answer that honestly. "I spent 9 years watching a tech company from the inside. Not as an executive. I was never an executive. As someone who was adjacent to strategy and capital allocation and the gap between what companies said publicly and what they were actually doing. You see things from that angle that you don't see from inside the organizational chart. Why aren't you running something?" The question landed with a directness she hadn't fully anticipated, though she should have given Helen's style. "I've been running something," Lillian said, "my own practice for about 7 months. An art business that is increasingly also a media and licensing business. I'm still figuring out its edges. Would you be open to thinking about it as the foundation of something larger?" Lillian ate a bite of her meal and thought about the question seriously, which Helen seemed to recognize and wait for. "I'm open to understanding what you mean by that," she said finally. Helen meant an accelerator relationship. Not a fund investment, not yet, but a formalized advisory and resource-sharing arrangement through Unravel that would give Lillian access to the legal, financial, and operational infrastructure that small creative enterprises typically lacked until they were large enough to afford it. In exchange, Unravel would take a small equity stake in whatever entity Lillian decided to formalize. "It's not the most lucrative deal for you," Helen said, with the frankness of someone who considered this a selling point rather than an admission. "The benefit is infrastructure, network, and the signal value of being in the portfolio. We're selective. Our companies get taken seriously." "I need time to think about it," Lillian said. "Of course, but not too long. We have 1 spot in the current cohort." Lillian spent 3 days with the materials Helen sent over. She read the term sheet with the same attention she'd given the divorce settlement, annotating in the margins, flagging questions, identifying the clauses that mattered and the ones that were standard boilerplate. She called Dana to look at it from a legal angle and called Grace to look at it from a financial one. Both of them said the same thing in their different registers. It was a fair deal from a credible party, and the equity ask was modest given the value of the network access. She signed on the 4th day. She told her mother about it during their next call. Vera listened to the whole explanation. The Meridian partnership, the investment positions, the Unravel arrangement, with the concentrated attention she brought to things she considered genuinely important. When Lillian finished, Vera was quiet for a moment. "You're describing a business," she said. "I know. Not just an art practice. A business." "I know, Mom." Another pause. "Are you happy?" Lillian sat with the question. She was in the kitchen, in the condo she still hated but had stopped noticing as much lately, with the morning light doing something decent with the windows for once. On the table in front of her were the Unravel signed documents, a sketchbook with the beginning of what would be the first piece of the next collection, and a coffee that had gone lukewarm while she'd been making notes. "I don't know if happy is quite the right word," she said. "I feel like myself, more than I have in a long time. Maybe more than I have since before the marriage, actually. Since before I started building things for someone else." That sounds right to me, Vera said. That sounds like you got yourself back. Lillian looked at the sketchbook. The first lines of the new piece were rough and tentative, the way first lines always were, the beginning of an argument she hadn't yet figured out how to finish. I think I'm getting to someone slightly past who I was, she said, which is maybe how it's supposed to work. Her mother said something warm then, the kind of thing a mother says when she's genuinely proud, not the performed version, but the real one that comes out quieter and plainer. Lillian listened to it all and didn't rush to fill the space after it. Outside, the fog was burning off the bay the way it did on mornings when the day was going to be clear. She had not stopped finding that beautiful, the quality of light when the fog lifted. In the worst months, it had been one of the few things she reliably noticed. She noticed it now, and it still worked, and that was enough. While Lillian was building, Ethan was performing. That was the word for it, if you were being honest. The life he was living in the months after the divorce was not quite a life, so much as a sustained public demonstration of one. He and Vanessa had moved into a house in Pacific Heights. A renovation project, technically, though in practice it had been a series of increasingly expensive decisions made by an interior designer Vanessa had found and Ethan had written checks for without fully understanding what he was agreeing to. The house photographed beautifully. That was more or less what it had been optimized for. They appeared at industry events, at charity dinners, at the kind of semi-public gatherings that existed at the intersection of tech money and social aspiration. Vanessa had a gift for these environments. She moved through them with the ease of someone who had studied their geometry from the inside, who understood which conversations mattered and which were decoration, who to stay near and who to move away from smoothly enough that the departure didn't register. Ethan had always been competent at these events. Serious, impressive, occasionally charming in his blunt instrument way, but beside Vanessa he found himself operating slightly behind the beat, following a tempo she was setting. He told himself this was fine, that he was tired, that the acquisition negotiations he'd been running since February were consuming the majority of his mental bandwidth, that the adjustment of living with someone new after 9 years of marriage was simply something that took time. He told himself these things more often as the months went on. The pregnancy progressed visibly, and Vanessa wore it well, in the way she wore most things, with a kind of deliberate presentation that made Ethan occasionally wonder, in the private space of 3 a.m. insomnia, whether anything she did was entirely unconsidered. He pushed the thought away when it surfaced. It was an unfair thought, born of his own complicated feelings about impending fatherhood, about the 3 pregnancies he and Lillian had lost, about the particular way life had a tendency to give you what you'd wanted in a form slightly skewed from what you'd imagined. He was going to be a father. He tried to land on that fact as something simple and good. It was harder than it should have been. The first thing that caught his attention was small enough that he almost missed it. It was early June, a Saturday morning. Vanessa was still asleep. She slept late, had slept late from the beginning, which Ethan had initially found endearing and had more recently begun to find merely inconvenient. And he was in the kitchen with coffee and his phone, cycling through the news and messages he'd missed overnight. There was a text from his assistant about a Monday call. A message from his college roommate, now a portfolio manager in New York, about a golf trip that Ethan kept meaning to commit to and kept finding reasons not to. And a short email from Vanessa's brother, Drew, sent to a joint household account that Ethan hadn't known existed until this moment. It was an innocuous email on its surface. Drew was asking about a visit. The following month, he said, he thought he could make it work, and he wanted to see Vanessa before things got too close to the due date. The email was warm, casual, the ordinary cadence of a sibling communication, but it referenced something in passing, a phrase that read as the tail end of a longer private conversation that stopped Ethan's eye. Tell him what you told me about the timeline. He'll feel better once he understands how these things work. Ethan read the sentence 3 times. He set his phone face down on the counter and finished his coffee standing at the window, looking out at the street. He was a man who dealt in information, who had spent 20 years making decisions based on data and analysis, and one of the skills that had served him in that work was the ability to identify when a piece of information was load-bearing without yet knowing what it was supporting. This sentence was load-bearing. He did not say anything to Vanessa that day. He was not yet sure what there was to say, or whether the unease he was feeling was evidence of something real or of evidence of his own capacity for anxiety in the final months of a pregnancy he hadn't been ready for emotionally. He set the feeling aside and attended to the day, a brunch with business contacts, a walk that was more exercise than pleasure, an afternoon of work that was supposed to be a weekend but rarely was. But the sentence stayed with him. He began over the following 2 weeks to pay a different kind of attention, not surveillance. He wasn't there yet, or didn't want to be. More like the particular alertness of a person who has noticed a sound in a building they don't quite recognize and is now listening with both ears rather than one. Small things that had not previously registered began to register. Vanessa's phone, which was always present and always screened down when she set it on a table. The way certain conversations about her family, about her life before Caldwell Technologies, about the specific timeline of events in the year before they had gotten together, seemed to arrive at natural-sounding endpoints before they'd quite started. The name of the doctor she'd been seeing, which she had mentioned once and which, when Ethan had looked up the practice out of nothing more than idle curiosity, turned out to be a different specialty than she'd implied. He thought about the email from Drew. He thought about the phrase, the timeline. On a Tuesday afternoon in late June, while Vanessa was at a prenatal appointment he had not been asked to attend, she had, he now realized, not asked him to attend the last 3. He sat in his home office and spent an hour and a half doing what he rarely did with personal matters, systematic research. He was not proud of this hour. He would not be proud of it later. But he did it, because once the pattern of doubt had organized itself into something coherent and directional, the only way he knew how to operate was toward the answer rather than away from it. What he found was not a confession. It was not a document or a message that said the thing plainly. It was a series of overlapping inconsistencies, a timeline of Vanessa's stated account of the past 18 months that did not hold its shape under examination. A social media post she had made from a different account, private but not private enough, that put her at an out-of-town event on a weekend she had told him she was visiting her mother. A name, a man named Garrett Town, mentioned twice in different contexts, each mentioned slightly overcorrected in a way that people overcorrect when they are trying to make something look casual. He looked up Garrett Town. Garrett Town was 34 years old, worked in commercial real estate development, and had been photographed at the same out-of-town event that Vanessa's post had documented. He was lean and dark-haired and handsome in an easy, uncomplicated way, the kind of handsomeness that did not announce itself. In the photograph Ethan found, he was standing with a group of people at what looked like a rooftop party, laughing at something outside the frame. Ethan stared at that photograph for a long time. He closed his laptop and sat in the dark of his office for a while. The house was very quiet. Outside the window, the afternoon traffic moved up the hill in its ordinary rhythm, indifferent to the particular thing that was happening in this room. He felt, with a precision that surprised him, the exact shape of what it was like to understand something you have been not understanding on purpose. He hired a private investigator the following week. He told himself this was excessive and did it anyway, because he understood that what he needed was not suspicion, but certainty, and he was not capable of achieving certainty through his own efforts without destroying something in the process. The investigator, a quiet, matter-of-fact man named Ray Costas, who had been recommended by his attorney, and who had the particular energy of someone who had seen enough of human behavior to be surprised by very little, asked clear questions and took notes, and said he would be in touch within 2 weeks. The 2 weeks were among the worst of Ethan's life, and his life had recently contained several contenders for that position. He went through them performing normalcy, attending meetings, answering emails, eating dinners across from Vanessa in the newly renovated kitchen with its expensive fixtures, and saying the things that a person says at dinner when they are trying to act like a person having dinner. He was not sure whether he succeeded. Vanessa seemed, to his heightened observation, slightly more careful in those weeks, more attentive than usual, more physically affectionate in the way that could mean warmth or could mean something else entirely. He could not tell anymore which things meant what. That was perhaps the worst part. Ray Costas called on a Thursday morning with a request to meet in person. They met at a coffee shop in the Sunset District, far enough from Ethan's usual geography that the encounter felt improbable, which was the point. Ray sat down across from him and put a plain manila folder on the table. Before I show you this, Ray said, I want to say that what's in here is documented and verified. I don't bring you speculation. Show me. Ray opened the folder. The documentation was thorough. A chronology of contact between Vanessa and Garrett Town that predated Ethan and Vanessa's relationship by over a year and had never, by any evidence Ray had been able to find, fully ceased. Cell tower data from a carrier subpoena, legal, Ray confirmed, placing both of them at the same locations on multiple occasions during the past year. A photograph taken outside an apartment building in the marina that Ethan recognized after a moment as belonging to Garrett Town. The last document in the folder was a medical record summary set, not the records themselves, which Ray couldn't legally obtain, but a summary produced through a source he didn't specify, which gave the gestational timeline and the probable conception window. Ethan read the dates twice. He looked up. The conception window, he said flatly. Puts it at a point in time when you and Ms. Reed had been together approximately 3 weeks, Ray said. He said it without editorializing, the way a person delivers information that is going to do its own damage without any assistance from the delivery. Ethan sat back in his chair. The coffee shop moved around him. A barista calling an order, 2 women with laptops at the corner table, the ambient noise of a weekday morning in an ordinary neighborhood, and all of it felt very far away, behind glass. 3 weeks. He had left his marriage of 10 years. He had told Lillian, who had stayed through every hard year, who had carried every loss alongside him, who had built half of what he called his own legacy and received no credit for any of it. He had told her the truth of what he was doing and destroyed her quiet in the name of honesty. And the thing he had told her was not even real. The child that had been the anchor of everything, the irreversible fact that he had used to justify every choice he had made, that child was not his. He put the folder closed on the table. He put his hands flat on either side of it. What do you need from me to close this out? He asked. His voice was even. He was proud of how even it was, and hated that he was proud of it. Just your signature on the final invoice, Ray said, and I'd recommend keeping this documentation somewhere secure. Ethan nodded. He signed the invoice. He put the folder under his arm and walked out of the coffee shop and stood on the sidewalk in the morning sun and let the full weight of it settle into his body, which took a few minutes and was not a pleasant process. Then he got in his car and drove home. Vanessa was in the living room when he arrived, on the phone, standing by the large window that overlooked the street with the light behind her that the renovation had been specifically designed to capture at this time of day. She registered his entry and made a small gesture that meant 1 minute and continued her conversation. Ethan set his keys on the table and sat down in the armchair that was the most expensive piece of furniture in the room and waited. She finished the call and turned to face him, and whatever she saw in his expression made her go still. "Hey," she said. The single syllable was careful. "Sit down," he said. "Ethan, please sit down." She sat on the sofa across from him. Her hands went to her lap in a gesture that was either instinctive self-protection or the beginning of a performance. He could no longer tell with her, and the inability to tell was itself part of what was destroying him in this moment. He put the manila folder on the coffee table between them. He did not open it. He did not need to open it. "Tell me about Garrett Town," he said. The silence that followed was approximately 4 seconds long and contained more information than anything she said afterward. "He's an old friend," she said. "I've mentioned him before." "You mentioned the name twice, in ways designed to make it sound unremarkable." Ethan's voice was still even. The evenness was costing him considerably. "That's different from mentioning him. I don't know what you think I'm not asking you what I think. I'm asking you to tell me the truth. I'd like, at some point in this conversation, to hear the actual truth from you." He paused. "I hired someone. I have documentation. So the question isn't whether I know. I know. The question is whether you're going to tell me directly, or whether I'm going to have to sit here and watch you try to manage this." Vanessa looked at the folder. She looked at him. Something in her face shifted. Not to remorse exactly, not to the simple human crumbling of someone caught. More like a recalibration. A person reassessing the situation from new coordinates. "You hired a private investigator," she said. "Yes. That feels invasive." He stared at her. "You want to talk about what feels invasive?" She looked away, out the window. The light was still beautiful, still doing what it had been designed to do. Garrett and I have a history, she said finally. It's complicated. Is the baby his? The pause before her answer was a fraction of a second too long, and they both knew it. I don't know, she said. That's not the same as no. Ethan, that is not the same as no. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, which he had not intended. He pressed his hands flat on his thighs the way Lillian had done, sitting across from him, in the living room in Marine, on the night he had told her everything. He had not thought about that parallel until this exact moment, and the arrival of it was a particular kind of awful. I was going to tell you, Vanessa said. When the time was right. When was the time going to be right? After the baby was born? After we'd been living this for another year? He stopped, restarted more quietly. You came to me with the pregnancy and told me it was mine. You let me believe, you watched me believe for months, something that you knew might not be true. You don't know that I knew. You knew. He was sure of it. He couldn't prove the interior of her knowledge, but he was sure of it. And her voice when she said you don't know had the quality of a position being staked rather than a truth being stated. She didn't push back again. They sat in the expensive living room in the beautiful light for a moment that felt much longer than it was. I need you to leave, Ethan said. Ethan, not tonight. I need some time to… He stopped. I need a few days. I need to think, but I need you to stay somewhere else while I do that. She looked at him carefully, and he had the experience, one he'd had before with her, but less often, less clearly, of being assessed, of being an equation being solved. Okay, she said. She said it in a tone he could not read. She went upstairs. He heard movement overhead for the better part of an hour. Then he heard her come back down and stop in the doorway to the living room. For what it's worth, she said, I do care about you. He looked at her. He believed she believed that. He wasn't sure it meant what she thought it meant. That's not what this was about, he said. She left. He sat in the house for a long time after she was gone. The silence had a different texture than the silence after Lillian had left. After that, the house had still contained the memory of her, the details she had placed and arranged, the living warmth of a person embedded in a space. This house had never had that quality. It had been a project from the beginning, a beautiful, expensive container that no one had ever actually inhabited. He thought about calling someone, his CFO, who was also something approaching a friend, in the truncated way that Ethan's professional relationships had always approximated friendship without quite achieving it. His brother in Denver, who he spoke to 3 or 4 times a year, and who would pick up the phone and say the right things and mean them, and with whom he had, somewhere along the way, lost the ability to be fully honest. He thought about calling Lillian. He sat with that impulse long enough to understand it was real, and then long enough to understand it was not something he could act on. Not tonight. Possibly not at all. He had a sense, vague but persistent, that Lillian had moved somewhere he couldn't follow. Not geographically, but in the larger sense, the sense of a person who has completed a transition that cannot be reversed. He had contributed significantly to that transition and had no standing to feel surprised by its results. He poured 2 inches of scotch and didn't drink it. He sat with it until the ice melted, which he had always considered a waste, and which tonight felt like the appropriate management of the evening. What? The conversation with Vanessa, the real one, the final one, happened 4 days later. She had stayed at a hotel, and they had spoken briefly by phone in the interim, the kind of carefully managed communications that happened when 2 people were circling something they hadn't yet agreed on how to address. She came back to the house on a Sunday afternoon, and they sat at the kitchen table, which felt oddly appropriate. Kitchens were where the real conversations happened, the ones without staging, and she told him the full account. She and Garrett Town had been together on and off for 3 years before Ethan. It had not been a simple relationship. Garrett was not, she said, with a flatness that suggested a wound that had healed badly, a person who was capable of the kind of commitment she had eventually stopped hoping for. When the relationship with Ethan had developed, she had seen it for what it was: real attraction, genuine ambition, and an opportunity to finally close the door on something that had cost her years of her life. She had meant to end things with Garrett entirely. She had not entirely ended them. The pregnancy, and here she stopped for a moment and looked at her hands. The pregnancy had come at a point when she and Garrett had seen each other once, briefly, in a way she had afterward decided was definitively the last time. She had told herself this. She had believed it was possible that the child was Ethan's. Possible, Ethan said. Yes. You told me it was mine. She looked up. I wanted it to be yours. That's not the same thing. I know that, she said. And for the first time in the conversation, she sounded like something other than a person managing a situation. She sounded tired. Real. I know it's not the same thing. I made a decision that was wrong, and I made it hoping the facts would resolve in a way that made it okay, and they didn't. And I understand that She stopped. I've put you through something that wasn't fair. Ethan sat with that for a moment. He was looking for the anger, which had been accessible and sharp in the first days, and which had settled over the week into something heavier and more complicated. He found it was still there, but underneath it now was something else. Not forgiveness. That was too large a word for this moment and this particular set of facts. More like a weariness with the whole architecture of deception, the specific exhaustion of a man who had spent the last year and a half living inside a story that had not been real. What does Garrett know? He asked. He knows there's a possibility. I haven't told him the specifics. Are you going to tell him? She was quiet for a moment. I don't know. You need to know, Ethan said. Whatever else happens here, that's not a conversation you can indefinitely avoid. She nodded slowly. I want a paternity test, he said. I need the actual answer. Okay? And I need you to understand. He paused. Not for effect, but because he was finding the sentence as he went. I need you to understand that regardless of what the test says, the way you handled this, the choice you made when you found out, and then kept making every day after that, I can't get past that. Not in the way you'd need me to. She looked at him. Her expression was complicated in a way he realized he had rarely seen from her. Not the careful management of an impression, but something more undefended. I understand, she said. He believed her. The paternity test came back 3 weeks later. Ethan read the results at his desk, alone, in the early evening after the office had emptied. He had asked his attorney to receive and transmit the documentation, and it arrived in a sealed PDF that he opened and read once and closed without reading again. Garrett Town was the father. Ethan sat back in his chair and looked at his office. He had occupied this office for 6 years, had worked through hundreds of early mornings and late nights in this room, had made decisions here that had moved markets and built the company that now bore his name. The room was full of the evidence of what he had achieved and was almost completely empty of anything that indicated who he was when he wasn't achieving. No photographs. He had never put photographs up because there was always something more pressing, some reason to keep the space spare and functional. He had told himself this was a preference, an aesthetic, a choice. It occurred to him now that it might have been a symptom. He picked up his phone and thought about who to call. The list was shorter than it should have been for a man his age and his profile. He scrolled through his contacts and felt, for the first time with real clarity, the cost of the way he had organized his life. The deals made and the relationships that had been background to the deals, the years in which he had treated his marriage as infrastructure and his friendships as networking, and his wife as a person who was simply there, solid and reliable, building things for him that he had never properly looked at. He called his CFO, Greg, and asked if he wanted to get a drink. Greg said yes, and they sat in a bar in the financial district for 3 hours, and Ethan told him more of the truth than he had told anyone in years. Greg listened with the attention of a man who had suspected more than he'd been told for a while, and said the things a friend says when someone is accountable for what they've done without requiring them to perform the accountability. You made a mess, Greg said, toward the end of the evening, not unkindly. Yes. The question is what you do with it now. Ethan looked at his glass. I'm working on that question. How's Lillian? Greg had always liked Lillian, had said once at a company dinner years ago that she was the most genuinely intelligent person in any room she entered, which Ethan had taken as a compliment by association, and which he now understood had been an observation he should have sat with more carefully. I don't know, Ethan said. We haven't spoken. I've heard things. What have you heard? Ethan set down his glass. What he had heard,
from two separate contacts independently in the past month was that Lillian Brooks was building something real. That her name was circulating in creative industry and investment circles in a way that suggested not just an artistic moment, but something with more structure and staying power beneath it. One contact had forwarded him the composite interview without comment, which was its own kind of comment. He had read the interview in his car on a Tuesday morning, and when he'd finished, he had sat for a while without starting the engine. She had not mentioned him. She had not mentioned the marriage or the divorce or any of the specific topography of what she'd been through. But the work she described, the night it had taken to make P7, the months of building towards something she couldn't yet name, was the most intimate and truthful account of a person in the middle of their own reinvention that he had read in years. Maybe ever. It was better writing than anything she had ever been given credit for producing, which was part of the point, and he knew it. "She's doing well," he told Greg. "Better than well, by the sounds of it." Greg nodded. He had the wisdom not to say anything more about it. July was a month of consequences arriving in their various forms. Vanessa moved out formally at the beginning of the month. It was a practical and largely undramatic process, managed through attorneys, and when it was done, the house in Pacific Heights settled into a kind of expensive emptiness that was neither comfortable nor clearly temporary. Ethan was not sure what to do with the house. He had not bought it. Vanessa had found it. Vanessa had overseen the renovation. Vanessa had stood in rooms and told the designer what she wanted, and the designer had produced it. It was a house that had been built as a setting for a life that had not been real, and living inside it felt accordingly strange. He put it on the market in August. Caldwell Technologies, meanwhile, was in a period of operational difficulty that he had been managing carefully and publicly minimizing. The acquisition he'd been pursuing since February had collapsed in June, which had cost the company 6 months of executive attention and a significant amount of legal expense. And the vacuum left by that collapse had exposed some slower-moving problems in the core business that he should have addressed 18 months earlier and hadn't because his attention had been elsewhere. His attention had been very elsewhere. 2 board members requested an informal meeting in July, which was the polite version of a formal meeting with less deniability for everyone involved. Ethan attended and gave them the accurate version of the situation, the numbers, the timeline for the remediation strategy he had begun building, the realistic outlook, and sat across from 2 men who had believed in him for years and were now looking at him with the careful neutrality of people reassessing their position. "You've had a difficult year personally," one of them said, in the tone of a person who has chosen the diplomatic framing. "I have," Ethan said. "That's not an excuse for the numbers." "No," the other one agreed. "It isn't." He drove home from that meeting through traffic and did not turn on the radio, which he usually used as a way of filling the silence in the car. The silence felt like something he needed to be present for. He thought about what Greg had said. The question is what you do with it now. He thought about the folder Ray Costas had put on the coffee shop table. He thought about the night in the living room in Marin when he had stood in front of the fireplace Lillian had chosen and told her the truth in the language of a business memo. He thought about her bare feet on the cold marble floor and her voice saying how long, with a precision that had been, he understood now, a last act of composure from a woman whose composure had been far more hard-won than he had ever understood. He had treated her like infrastructure. He had treated her contributions like ambiance. He had believed in the arrogant way of people who build visible things, that the visible things were what mattered, and that the invisible labor surrounding them was simply the natural environment of his success. He had been wrong about this in a way that was simple and total and could not be fixed. He was beginning to understand that understanding it was only the first part of the problem. The harder part was deciding who to be on the other side of that understanding. He did not have an answer yet, but he was sitting with the question more honestly than he had sat with anything in a long time. And in the dark and quiet of the car, in the particular still heat of a July evening in the city that felt like the only starting point available to him, he drove home to the house that was already listed for sale and parked and sat in the driveway for a while longer before going inside. The house in Pacific Heights sold in 6 weeks. It went for a number that should have felt like a win. The renovation had added real value. The market was cooperative, the timing decent. But Ethan felt nothing particular when his attorney called to confirm the closing.
He was in his office, sitting at his desk in the late afternoon with the bay visible through the window going gold in the September light. And he said the right words and ended the call and sat for a moment in the particular flatness of a man who has learned that the completion of a transaction is not the same as the resolution of anything. He moved into a furnished apartment in Soma while he figured out what came next. The apartment was clean and efficient and utterly without character, which seemed appropriate. He had lost his appetite for beautiful spaces that existed primarily to demonstrate something. The Soma apartment had a good desk and fast internet and a view of the street that was not scenic but was at least honest, traffic and pedestrians, and the ordinary chaos of a city block going about its business. He worked from it most mornings before going into the office, and in the evenings he stayed later at the office than he used to, partly because there was real work to be done, and partly because the apartment was easier to return to once the city had gone dark, and the decision was simply about sleep, rather than about how to fill the remaining hours. He was 51 years old, and he was learning, with the specific discomfort of someone who had spent 3 decades in forward motion, what it felt like to be genuinely still. The business problems were real and required his full attention, which was the one thing the fall had going for it. There was no space for extended self-examination when the operational situation demanded concrete decisions, the kind of decisions that had consequences for hundreds of people and couldn't be deferred or delegated or smoothed over with the right language and the right presentation. The acquisition collapse had been the visible fracture, but the underlying issue was older than that. Caldwell Technologies had grown quickly and then grown complacent, which was a pattern Ethan had recognized in other companies and had believed himself immune to, which was itself a symptom of the problem. In the years when his personal life had been consuming the bandwidth that should have gone to strategy, the company had continued moving on its existing momentum without anyone applying the kind of disruptive forward thinking that had built it in the first place. The product roadmap was defensible, but not exciting. 2 of his best engineers had left for competitors in the past year, and when he'd reviewed the exit interview notes, which he had not done at the time because he'd been elsewhere, he found a version of the same observation in both. The sense that the company had stopped being a place where interesting things were happening. That one landed. He spent October and November in a mode of operation he had used successfully in the early years and had largely abandoned in the middle ones, deeply in the work, not at the level of management, but at the level of the actual product. He sat with the engineering teams for days at a time. He asked questions rather than issuing directives, which was not entirely natural for him, but which produced, he found, a quality of conversation he had not been getting from his executive briefings. People who are asked what they actually think will sometimes tell you. It was not a complicated insight, but it was one he had allowed to atrophy. Greg watched this from the CFO seat with something that was half relief and half wariness. "You're back," he said, one morning in November, coming into Ethan's office and finding him on a whiteboard working through a product architecture problem with 2 engineers he would not, 6 months ago, have been in direct conversation with. "I've been here," Ethan said. "You know what I mean." He did know what Greg meant. There was a version of him that had been in the building for the past several years, capable, credentialed, functional, and a different version that was actually present, actually thinking rather than managing the appearance of thinking. The second version was harder to sustain and produced better outcomes, which was a thing he kept relearning. The board meeting in November went better than the one in July. The numbers were still not where they needed to be, but the trajectory had shifted, which was what boards actually needed to see. Not perfection, but direction. One of the 2 members who had looked at him with careful neutrality in July looked at him this time with something closer to confidence, which he noted without allowing himself to rest on. Confidence was not a destination. He had made that mistake before. But he had been tracking Lillian's career with the slightly obsessive attention of someone who knows they should be doing something else and can't quite stop. It was not dignified, this tracking. He understood that. But it was also, in a way he had difficulty articulating, important to him. Not in a possessive sense, not as a way of maintaining any claim on a life he had forfeited, but in the sense that he was trying to understand something true about what he had built and what he had let go of without realizing its value. Watching what Lillian was building from a distance felt like the long-delayed process of seeing clearly. What he saw was considerable. The composite interview had been the first thing he'd read, back in the spring. Since then, he had followed the Meridian collection launch from the outside. He had, in a moment of something he wasn't proud of, created a secondary email address to access the platform as a regular viewer rather than as himself, which was its own kind of evidence about where his head was. He had looked at the new collection the night it launched, alone in the Soma apartment with the city noise coming through the window, and sat with it for a long time. The work was different from What Remains. Less raw, as she had said in the interview, more constructed, more deliberate. But it had something the first collection hadn't quite had, which was a quality of forward motion. The pieces in What Remains were brilliant and devastating, and they sat with pain in a way that was entirely honest. The new work contained that pain as an element rather than as the whole weather system. There was something in it that looked ahead, that was interested in what came next. He had closed the laptop and not been able to sleep for a while. He thought about what it had taken to make that work, and what it had cost her to get there, and the specific role he had played in creating the conditions for it. He did not allow himself the comfortable version of this thought, the one in which her success retroactively justified what he'd done. It didn't. The work was extraordinary because she was extraordinary, because she had turned genuine suffering into something real rather than being destroyed by it. And that capacity had nothing to do with him, except insofar as he had been the specific instrument of the suffering. Those were separate facts, and he tried to hold them separately. He was not entirely successful at this, but he tried. In late October, he ran into an old Stanford acquaintance named Patrick Sue at a conference, the kind of mid-sized industry gathering that existed for networking more than content. Patrick was now a partner at a venture firm and had the comfortable, slightly dispersed energy of a man who has achieved what he set out to achieve and is now largely trying to maintain it. They found each other at the edge of the cocktail hour with the mutual relief of two people who actually know each other in a room full of approximate acquaintances. They talked for a while about the conference, about the industry in general, about a mutual friend's company that had recently gone through a rough funding round. Then Patrick, with the slightly too casual timing of someone who has been waiting to bring something up, said, "I saw the piece about Lillian." Ethan looked at him. "The composite thing," Patrick said. "And then someone forwarded me a note from the Ironvale portfolio announcement. She's operating at a serious level." "I know," Ethan said. "You've been following it?" "Some." Patrick turned his glass in his hands. They had known each other well enough back at Stanford to have the kind of conversation that skipped over the social niceties, and that residual directness apparently hadn't entirely faded. "How are you doing with it? Honestly?" Ethan thought about the honest answer, which was not a simple one. "It's complicated," he said. "I'm glad for her. That's real. I'm genuinely glad she's doing what she's doing, and I'm also aware of what it costs to get her there. What you cost her." "Yes." Patrick nodded, not unsympathetically. "Have you been in contact?" "No, I've thought about it." A pause. "I'm not sure I have any standing to be in contact." "That's probably a healthy thing to be uncertain about." "It doesn't feel healthy." Patrick smiled, not unkindly. "No, I imagine it doesn't." They changed the subject after that, by mutual and unspoken agreement, and the rest of the conversation was easier. But walking back through the hotel lobby later, Ethan turned the exchange over and came back to the phrase, "any standing." He had used it without thinking, but it was the right framing. Standing, the right to show up somewhere and expect to be heard, was something that had to be earned, and the earning had to be genuine rather than strategic. He had spent enough time in rooms with people performing accountability to know the difference between that and the real thing. He was still figuring out which one he was doing. November moved toward December, and the city shifted into the particular quality of late fall that Ethan had always found oddly clarifying. The light lower and more direct, the streets slightly emptier on weekends, a general sense of the year beginning to understand that it was coming to an end. He had lived in the Bay Area for nearly 30 years, and the seasons here were subtle but real, and he had spent too many of them not noticing. He called his brother in Denver on a Sunday afternoon and had the kind of conversation they had been failing to have for years. Not the catch-up version, not the functional touching base call, but something closer to actual honesty. His brother, whose name was Daniel, and who was 4 years younger and worked in hospital administration, and had been married to the same woman for 18 years with the kind of unglamorous fidelity that Ethan had always privately found slightly boring,
listened to everything Ethan said, and then was quiet for a moment.
You know what surprised me about all of this? Daniel said. When I heard about it. What? Not that you had the affair. I'm not saying that's fine, it's not fine. But I understood it, in the sense that I knew who you were. What surprised me was the pregnancy story. That you just took her word for it. She was convincing. You're one of the most skeptical people I've ever met in my life, Daniel said. You question things that don't need questioning. I've watched you take a 15-minute phone call apart on the drive home to identify every place where the other person's numbers didn't hold up. And with this, I wanted it to be true, Ethan said.
Yeah, Daniel said quietly. I figured. The wanting had been its own kind of blindness. He had wanted the child to be his badly enough that he had let that wanting do the work of evaluation, which was not a mistake he made in business, and was therefore a mistake he had not recognized as one when he was making it. Grief could work on a person like that. The grief of 3 lost pregnancies, years of trying, the slowly closing door on the version of his life that included children.
Vanessa had arrived with an answer to a wound she hadn't known about in detail, but had, he now understood in general terms. She had been perceptive in the specific ways that served her. He did not think she was a simple person. He did not think what she had done was simple. People who were simply villainous were easy to dismiss, and dismissing her would have been easier than this, which was why he was trying not to do it. You need to figure out what you actually want, Daniel said. Not what you wanted a year ago, what you want now. I know. Do you? Ethan leaned back in his chair. Through the window, the Soma street was doing its Sunday afternoon thing. A couple walking a dog, a delivery driver on a bicycle, the ordinary continuous motion of other people's lives. I want to rebuild the company correctly, he said. Not just get the numbers back. Actually fix what was wrong. He paused. And I think I want to figure out how to be someone Lillian wouldn't recognize as the person she divorced. Daniel was quiet for a moment. For her or for yourself? The question was fair, and Ethan had been sitting with some version of it for weeks. The honest answer was that he wasn't entirely sure yet which of those motivations was primary and which was justification for the other, and he thought that uncertainty was probably worth respecting rather than resolving prematurely. I'm working on knowing the difference, he said. That's a better answer than the one I expected, Daniel said. He wrote a letter to Lillian in December. Not an email. A letter, handwritten on plain paper, which took him 4 drafts and most of an evening to produce. He had never been a man who wrote letters, which was part of why this felt necessary. It was the form least natural to him, which meant it required more of him, which meant it was less likely to be a performance and more likely to be the real thing. The letter was not long. 2 pages. It did not ask for anything. It did not propose a conversation or request a response or attempt to reestablish anything. It said that he understood what he had done, in the specific rather than the general, not just the affair, but the years before it, the ways he had treated her contributions as background, the way he had sat across from her in a room she had made beautiful and offered her a settlement number as if that were the appropriate language for the end of a decade. It said he was sorry, in terms plain enough that the apology couldn't be mistaken for throat-clearing before a request. And it said that he had been reading her work, not to claim any connection to it, but because it was remarkable, and because watching her build something entirely her own had taught him more about what he had undervalued than any of the other lessons of the past year. He sat with the letter for 2 days after he finished it. He reread it several times, looking for places where he was performing, rather than saying something true, and edited those places out. Then he sent it through Dana's office, because he did not have Lillian's current address, and because going through Dana felt like the right acknowledgement of the distance he had no right to close unilaterally. Dana's assistant confirmed receipt and said she would pass it along. He did not know if Lillian would read it. He did not know if she would respond. He had not written it in order to produce a response, which was, he thought, how he knew the apology was real. January arrived, and with it, a new set of operational demands that kept Ethan tightly occupied through the month. The product restructuring he'd initiated in October was beginning to show real traction. 2 of the engineers who had left had reached out independently in December, which was the kind of signal you paid attention to. The board meeting in January was the best one in 2 years. The numbers were not triumphant, but they were honest and improving. And the roadmap he presented was one he actually believed in, rather than one designed to delay a harder conversation. Afterward, Greg caught him in the hallway outside the conference room and said simply, "Good meeting." "It was a real meeting," Ethan said. "That's different." "I know. It's what I said." He was eating better, which he knew because he had been eating badly enough for long enough that the contrast was noticeable. He was sleeping more consistently. He had started running again, Sham, not the compulsive early morning punishing runs of his 30s, but something slower, more like movement for its own sake, which he had never previously understood as a concept and now found he needed. He ran along the Embarcadero on weekend mornings when the ferry docks were quiet and the bay was doing something interesting with the light. And he ran without music and without his phone and without planning his next meeting, and this was uncomfortable for the first several weeks, and gradually became the only hour of the day he looked forward to without ambivalence. He had dinner with Patrick Sue in late January, and they talked about a potential collaboration, a joint investment position in an infrastructure company they'd both been watching. And the conversation was good, the kind that left both people slightly more energized than when they'd arrived. Walking out afterward, Patrick said, "You seem different." "People keep saying that. It's a good different." Patrick paused on the sidewalk, hands in his jacket pockets, squinting slightly in the cold. "More like yourself." "I've been trying to figure out who that is," Ethan said. "Yeah, you and everyone else." Patrick said it without condescension, just the dry warmth of someone who had done their own version of this work. "The difference is you're actually doing it instead of just thinking about it." He did not receive a response to the letter. He had not expected one, and the absence did not collapse him, which he took as evidence that he had actually written it for the reasons he'd said he had, rather than as a covert bid for re-entry into her life. But it did produce a sustained awareness of her presence at the edges of his days. Not obsessive exactly, more like a low-frequency hum of unresolved feeling that he was learning to live alongside rather than either suppress or act on. He heard things, as people in a city hear things. Marcus Webb's name surfaced at an industry dinner in February, mentioned in connection with the Meridian platform's growth, and someone at the table mentioned that the platform's breakout creator had just confirmed a solo gallery show in Chicago and was developing what sounded like a larger institutional partnership. Ethan listened to this the way he listened to information about a company he admired and had no stake in, with genuine interest and no claim. Later that month, a woman named Carla Sims, who ran a tech-adjacent media company and whom he knew reasonably well from years of industry crossover, mentioned Lillian's name in an entirely different context, as someone Ironvale was featuring at an investor summit in March, one of a small cohort of portfolio founders selected for a keynote conversation. "You know her, don't you?" Carla said, in the slightly knowing way of someone who was aware of the history and was deciding how much to acknowledge it. "I did," Ethan said. He said it in the past tense and meant it in a complicated way that the past tense didn't entirely capture. "She's remarkable," Carla said. "I heard 30 seconds of her speaking at a Meridian event in January and wanted to follow her around with a notebook." Ethan looked at his wine glass. "She always was," he said. "I didn't always understand that." Carla looked at him, reassessing slightly. She had, he sensed, been prepared for a different response. Something more defended, more about the divorce's official narrative. His actual answer seemed to have landed differently. She moved the conversation on without pressing, which he was grateful for. But the exchange stayed with him. She always was. He had said it as if it were a simple acknowledgement, but sitting with it later, he understood it was the most honest sentence he'd produced about Lillian in years, possibly ever. It contained within it everything he had failed to demonstrate while he had the chance, and everything he was only now capable of saying clearly, which was the particular punishment built into growth that comes too late. The clarity arrived with the knowledge of what you would have done differently if you'd had it when it mattered. He went looking for her in late February, not in the stalking sense, not with the investigator's methodology, nothing like that. He simply decided, after several months of watching from a deliberate distance, that he needed to understand the shape of what she was doing, not through secondhand reports, but directly. He went to the Meridian platform under his real name this time and registered properly. He looked at both collections in full, spending a long time with each piece rather than moving through them quickly. He spent the most time with the last piece in the second collection, which was titled simply Ground, and which was, technically and emotionally, the most resolved work she had produced. It was large in its proportions, meant, he understood from the platform notes, to be experienced as an installation, where the viewer stood inside the scale of it rather than at a comfortable viewing distance. In the digital version, you could zoom into the component elements, and he did that, moving slowly through the layers she had built, recognizing in the construction the same quality of thought he had watched her bring to the brand work for his company for years. The layering, the intentionality, the refusal to let any element exist without purpose. She had always worked this way. He had just never looked. He closed the platform and sat with his coffee in the morning quiet of the Soma apartment and felt the full weight of a very specific kind of regret. Not the generic regret of someone who had made bad choices and wished they'd been different, but the precise and nearly unbearable regret of a man who understands exactly what quality of thing he had in his life and exactly how he had failed to see it. This was not useful feeling necessarily. It did not point toward action. It was simply the thing that was true, and sitting with it without converting it immediately into a plan was part of what he was trying to learn. He sat with it. The Ironvale Investor Summit, where Lillian was speaking, was in the second week of March, at a hotel in Palo Alto that he passed regularly. He was not invited. He was not, by any reasonable definition, someone who should be in the room. He found this out through Carla, who mentioned it again in an email about a different matter, and he spent 3 days deciding what he thought about his own response to the information, which was that he wanted to be there. He wanted to see her, not covertly, not through the second-hand lens of industry gossip or online documentation, but directly, in person, with whatever that entailed. He understood this impulse was partly selfish. He understood that showing up at an event in her professional life, uninvited and unexpected, was an imposition regardless of his intentions. He had no claim on her time or her attention, and the act of appearing, even at a large public event, was the act of placing himself in her field of vision when she had made no indication that this was something she wanted. He did not go to the summit. He made this decision on a Tuesday morning and then second-guessed it 3 times before the end of the day, and then held the decision because he recognized that the second-guessing was exactly the kind of impulse that needed to be overridden. He was trying to be different from the man who had treated her life as a resource for his own needs. That started here, in small acts of restraint that nobody would ever see or credit him for. He did not go. What he did instead, that week, was something that took him the better part of 3 evenings to complete. He went through the files from Caldwell Technologies' early years, the brand design documents, the investor presentations, the identity guidelines, the visual language standards that still governed every piece of public-facing communication the company produced. He had copies of these in the company's design archive, had always had them, had simply never examined them with any particular attention. He went through them now, slowly, file by file, with the attention they deserved. What he found, documented in time-stamped files going back to the company's second year, was comprehensive. Her creative involvement was not peripheral, and it was not generalist. It was foundational. The visual identity that investors and clients in the industry had associated with Caldwell Technologies for nearly a decade, the system of design choices that said trustworthy, forward-thinking, serious without being inaccessible, had been built by Lillian over years of sustained creative labor, without formal title, without salary, without acknowledgement. He knew this, in the abstract way that you can know something you have never fully looked at. Looking at it fully was different. He forwarded a summary of what he'd found to his attorney with a note that said the IP attribution matter, the secondary legal question that Dana's office had been pursuing since the previous year, should be resolved in Lillian's favor in full, and that he was authorizing his team to agree to the documentation language her attorneys were requesting without further negotiation. His attorney called the next morning, somewhat surprised. "This is a significant concession," she said. "Are you sure you want to—" "It's not a concession," Ethan said. "It's an accurate record. Make it happen." She did. He did not tell anyone else about this decision. He did not expect it to change anything. He made it because it was the right correction of a wrong thing, which was a sufficient reason on its own. And the habit of doing right things for reasons that were sufficient on their own was, he was slowly understanding, the actual work. Spring was coming. The mornings on the Embarcadero were lighter, and the bay had that quality it got in early March when the worst of the winter rain was behind it, wide and blue, and lit from underneath in a way that suggested possibility without promising anything specific. He ran farther than usual that Saturday. He was tired when he finished, and he did not mind the tiredness, which was the right kind, the kind produced by effort rather than the kind produced by years of moving in the wrong direction. He stood at the water's edge for a while, breathing, watching the ferry make its way through the bay toward the dock. He did not yet know that Lillian had received his letter and read it twice and kept it in the drawer of her drafting table without deciding what to do with it. He did not know that in 3 weeks, without either of them planning it, the distance between what he had become and what she was building would collapse into the same room. He knew only that he had stopped running away from the things he needed to face, and that this was different from having faced them, and that the difference mattered enormously. The ferry docked. Passengers moved off the gangway in the ordinary way of people who had somewhere to be. He turned and ran back through the city toward home. The gallery was called Meridian House, which was Marcus's idea and which Lillian had agreed to with the slight ambivalence she brought to anything that bore the name of the platform before the work. But the space itself had earned the name. It occupied the ground floor and basement of a converted warehouse in the Dogpatch neighborhood, the kind of building that had been a light industrial facility in a previous life and still carried that history in its bones. Exposed steel, concrete floors poured thick enough to park machinery on, ceiling heights that made you adjust your sense of proportion the moment you walked in. The Chicago installation had led to this. 6 weeks in a gallery on Michigan Avenue had produced the kind of critical and commercial response that changes the conversation around an artist's work, not just within the art world, which operated on its own rhythms, but in the broader cultural space where money and attention and institutional interest converged. The Chicago Tribune Review had used the phrase, "a career-defining body of work," in its second sentence, which Lillian had read once and then set aside because she had learned by now that reviews, good or bad, were information about the audience rather than about the work, and the work was already finished by the time any review existed. What the Chicago run had produced, practically, was the conversation with the San Francisco Museum of Contemporary Art about a future institutional acquisition, 3 new licensing agreements through the Iron Veil legal infrastructure, and the invitation from a developer she knew through the Meridian network to use the Dogpatch warehouse for a full-scale permanent installation show that would run for 8 weeks beginning in late March. She had said yes to the warehouse. The show was called Afterground, a continuation of the second collection, which had ended with the piece titled Ground as a kind of landing point, a first stillness after years of movement. Afterground asked the question that Ground had implicitly raised. What did you build on the stillness once you had it? It was the most technically ambitious work she had attempted. Large-scale pieces designed for the specific dimensions of the warehouse space, with a light installation component she had developed in collaboration with an engineer named Priya Suresh, who had worked on immersive environments for theater productions, and brought a precisely different sensibility that pushed Lillian's work in directions she wouldn't have reached alone. The collaboration had been difficult in the best way. They had disagreed about the light temperature for the central installation no fewer than 6 times, and arrived at a solution neither of them had initially imagined, which was how she knew it was right. The opening was on a Thursday evening in the last week of March. Lillian had been in the space for most of the preceding week, overseeing installation details, making the small adjustments that were the difference between a work that functioned correctly and a work that functioned exactly right. She had slept badly in that week, not from anxiety, but from the particular alertness of someone whose mind is still turning over problems even when the body is horizontal, and she arrived at the gallery on the evening of the opening with the specific tiredness that comes from having poured everything available into something and the specific clarity that sometimes arrives with that kind of exhaustion. She wore a dark blue dress she had bought in Chicago, plain in its construction, which suited the space. The work was here to fill the room, not her. She had her hair up, which she rarely did, and she had let Dana's assistant take her to a bar 2 hours before the opening and make her eat a proper meal, which she had done gratefully and without argument, because she had learned through the past 18 months that caring for the basic physical requirements of a body under pressure was not weakness, but maintenance. Marcus arrived at 6, an hour before the doors opened, and walked the space with her in the way they had developed the habit of doing before events, slowly,
without talking much, just letting the work speak in the absence of the crowd it was about to receive. He stopped for a long time in front of the central installation, which was built around a structure of suspended geometric forms in layered translucent material, with Priya's light moving through it in a sequence that cycled over 40 minutes, cold to warm, and then, in the final 10 minutes, into a quality of light that had no clean color name, something between amber and gold that made the shadows on the concrete floor shift into shapes that seemed almost biological. "I've been doing this for 12 years, Marcus said, still looking at the installation. "I've had maybe 4 shows in that time where I walked the space before the opening and felt something I couldn't account for. This is one of them." "Don't tell me that right now," Lillian said. "I have to go talk to people in an hour." "I'm telling you so you know it's real before the noise of the evening gets to it." He turned to look at her. "How are you feeling?" She considered the question, which she had learned not to answer reflexively. "Present," she said. "That's the best word. I feel very here." He nodded as if this made complete sense, which, for him, it probably did. The guests arrived at 7 and kept arriving until the space held something over 200 people, which was more than Lillian had expected, and which the space handled without feeling crowded. The warehouse dimensions absorbed the population and distributed it through the work rather than clustering it at the entrance. She moved through the evening in the way she had gotten better at over the past year, present in each conversation without being consumed by it, able to shift from the language of the work to the language of business to the language of simple warmth depending on what the moment required. A collector from Los Angeles who had acquired 2 pieces from the second collection found her near the central installation and talked about the experience of living with the work, which she found genuinely moving, not because it validated the work, but because it told her the work was doing what she had made it to do. Sophia Tanaka from Meridian was there with 2 members of the platform's investor group, and their conversation was brief and professional and warm in the way that a year of good collaboration produced. Helen Farrow from Ironvale moved through the room with the contained alertness she always had and gave Lillian a look at one point across the space that communicated something like "well done" without needing words. Priya Suresh stood near the light installation for most of the evening, watching people's responses to it with the quiet intensity of a person monitoring something technical that also happened to be beautiful. Lillian joined her twice, briefly, and each time felt the particular solidarity of 2 people who had made something difficult together and were now watching it exist in the world without them. Her mother had flown down from Portland. Vera Brooks stood near the far wall for most of the first hour, looking at the large format piece Lillian had placed there. A new work, not part of either previous collection, made specifically for this space and this show, and it was the most personal piece in the room. It did not announce this. It was abstract, like the rest of the work, built in the visual language Lillian had been developing for 2 years. But it was made from the shapes of the life she had actually lived. Not literally, not as illustration, but at the level of structure. The way a building is made from the specific conditions of the site it's built on. If you knew what it cost to make, you could see that in it. Most people wouldn't know. Her mother knew. Lillian went to her eventually, and they stood together in front of it for a moment. "When did you make this one?" Vera said. "January. One long night in January." Vera looked at it for another moment. "You put everything in it." "I tried to." Her mother turned and looked at her with the directness of someone who had been waiting through years of phone calls to say something face to face. "I'm proud of you," she said. "Not for the show, for the whole thing, for the person you've become in the last year and a half." Lillian held that. She did not deflect it or qualify it or make it smaller. She let it land. "Thank you," she said. It was the most complete sentence available. She was near the east wall, in conversation with Priya, and a structural engineer who had become interested in the installation from an architectural angle, when she registered a familiar profile across the room. She registered it the way you register something unexpected, a slight physical adjustment, a narrowing of attention, and then looked directly and confirmed what she'd thought. Ethan was standing near the entrance, still in his coat, holding a glass of wine he hadn't drunk. He was looking at one of the pieces on the near wall with an expression she couldn't fully read from across the room, but which was clearly not the expression of someone performing interest. He had come alone. He was thin in a way he hadn't been before. Not unhealthily so,
but differently, the way people look when they've been living at a different pace for a while and the body has adjusted. She felt something she had not expected to feel in this moment, which was not anger. A long time ago, she might have expected anger. What she felt was something more complicated and more tired than anger. The recognition of a person she had known for nearly 20 years, in a room she had built, carrying the visible weight of everything that had happened since the last time they'd stood in the same space. She excused herself from the conversation and moved across the room. He saw her coming when she was about 10 feet away. He straightened slightly but didn't move toward her, which she noted and credited him for. The decision to let her determine the terms of the approach. "Lillian," he said. "Ethan." She stopped a few feet from him. "I didn't know you were coming." "I wasn't sure I would." He looked around the space briefly, then back at her. "I heard about it through Carla Sims. I should have said I was coming. I understand if you'd rather I—" "You're here," she said. "That's already happened." A pause. He looked at her carefully. "How are you?" It was the question she had answered 1,000 times in the past 18 months, in 1,000 different registers. And from him it landed differently than from anyone else. Not because she owed him a more truthful answer, but because the question from him contained a decade of shared history that made it heavier than it had any right to be in a crowded room. "I'm well," she said. "I'm genuinely well. I can see that." He said it without the performing quality that would have made it hollow. He seemed to simply mean it. "The work is, Lillian, what you've built here is, thank you. I'm not saying it because I'm standing in front of you. I've been looking at the collections for months, the second one especially, that last piece. Ground. Ground, yes," he paused. "I spent a long time with it." She looked at him. The room moved around them and neither of them was fully in the room. "I know you've been following the work," she said. "Marcus told me you registered on the platform in the fall." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite embarrassment, but adjacent to it. "I wasn't sure you knew." He mentioned it. Not as a warning, just as a fact. "I'm sorry if it didn't feel like anything particular," she said. "You can look at work that's publicly available. That's what public means." She paused. "I read your letter." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know if I read it twice," she said. "Then I put it in a drawer and didn't decide what to do with it for 2 months, which is roughly how I handle most things that require more than one feeling at the same time." He looked at her. "I meant what I wrote. All of it." "I know you did," she said. That's actually what made it hard to answer. If it had been another version of the settlement conversation or an attempt to manage something, I could have ignored it cleanly. She let that land for a moment. "You writing something true and difficult put me in the position of having to figure out what I actually felt about it." "And what do you feel about it?" The question was direct enough that she almost smiled. There he was, the man she'd married, incapable of waiting out ambiguity, needing to know where things stood. "I feel that you've done some real work," she said, "not just the letter. I've heard things over the year about the company, about how you've been operating. Greg mentioned to someone who mentioned to someone that you'd been different." She paused. "And Dana told me about the IP documentation, the attribution." He looked slightly surprised. "She told you?" "She's my attorney. She tells me things that affect my interests." "I didn't do that for—" "I know why you did it," Lillian said. "That's why it mattered." She let a beat pass. "It was the right correction. It didn't undo anything, but it was right." He nodded. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. "I don't have any illusions about what I'm asking for here. I'm not asking for anything, actually. I needed you to know that I see clearly now what I couldn't see before. What you were, what you did, what it cost you to be married to someone who treated those things as ambient detail." She looked at him for a long moment. The central installation's light was doing the thing in its cycle, where it moved through the cold blue phase and the room shifted slightly, the shadows lengthening and cooling. She watched it for a second before she responded. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Yes." "I knew about Vanessa before you told me." He went still. "Not every detail," she said. "Not the pregnancy, not her name initially, but I knew the shape of it for several months before that night in the living room. I'm not sure how or when exactly I knew. It was more like something that assembled itself from small pieces over time. And I made a decision, during those months, not to confront it. Why? It was the right question, and she had thought about the answer enough that she could give it cleanly. Because I wasn't ready, she said. And because I had spent so long building my identity around our life together that I genuinely didn't know who I was without it. I needed the ending to come from outside rather than from me, because I didn't have enough of myself left to initiate it on my own. She paused. That's not a comfortable thing to admit. I've sat with it for a year and a half, and I've gotten to a place where I can say it plainly. He was listening with the total attention she had always believed him capable of, and rarely seen him deploy on anything personal. When you told me that night, she continued, part of what I felt, underneath the grief and the anger and all the rest of it, was something like relief, which made me feel terrible about myself for a long time. And then I made the work. And the work helped me understand that the relief wasn't about you. It was about finally having ground under my feet. Even terrible ground is ground. You can't build on suspension. He was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, he said. Not as a reflex, as a fact. I know. She said it without softening it and without using it as a door to something else. It was its own sentence. Giti. They moved by unspoken agreement to a less populated corner of the space, near a large piece on the north wall that Lillian had titled Construction, which was one of the most formally complex works in the show, built from a geometry of accumulation, each layer visible through the one above it so that the history of the making was part of the finished surface. How is the company? She asked. She asked it because it was a real question, not because she was filling space. Better than 6 months ago, not where it needs to be yet. He looked at the piece on the wall. I've been doing the actual work, which I stopped doing for a while. It helps. It does help, she agreed. There's something stabilizing about working at the level of the material itself rather than the level of managing other people, managing the material. You figured that out faster than I did. I had more motivation. He almost smiled. It was the first time in the conversation that his face had shifted towards something lighter, and it changed the temperature between them slightly in the way that a shared joke, or the ghost of one, can do between two people who spent years in each other's company. The Iron Veil Partnership, he said, and the Meridian Platform, and the investment positions Grace Okonkwo has been building with you. He paused. You built a real enterprise. I did. It wasn't the settlement, he said. It was not a question, but it wasn't quite a statement either. It was an attempt to understand. The settlement was capital, she said. Capital is inert without a direction and a decision. I provided those. She looked at him. You provided the capital and the years of observing how the tech and creative industries intersected, which I didn't know I was accumulating until I needed it. I'd be dishonest if I said none of that time had value. That's more generous than I deserve. It's accurate, she said. I'm not being generous, I'm being precise. Those are different things, and I've spent a lot of time this year learning to keep them separate. He turned to face her more directly. What does your life look like now? Day to day, I mean. Not the career outline. The question surprised her slightly. Its specificity, its interest in the texture rather than the architecture. It was not the kind of question the Ethan she had been married to had asked. I wake up early, she said, earlier than I used to. I work in the morning before anything else because the morning is when the work is clearest. I have coffee and I look at what I made the day before, and I either continue it or I set it aside. I run most days, which I started doing in the fall because the insomnia was bad, and I needed a way to use my body before my mind took over the whole day. She paused. I talk to my mother more. I have actual friends now, not the network friends. Marcus, Dana, Priya, who I made this show with, Sophia from the platform. You weren't isolated before, he said. You had people. I had people around our life, she said, which is different. When that life ended, I found out that some of them were attached to the life and not to me. The ones who stayed are the ones who are now actually in it. She looked at the piece on the wall. I see the difference more clearly now. He was quiet for a moment, listening to the room. The ambient conversation, the slight echo of the warehouse ceiling, the sound of that many people in the presence of something they were genuinely trying to understand. Is there room in that life, he said carefully, for whatever this is? She knew what he meant, and she had been prepared for the question because she had been preparing for some version of it since she'd seen him across the room. "I don't know what this is yet," she said, "and I'm not going to decide tonight in the middle of my opening with 200 people in the room." She looked at him directly. "What I can tell you is that the person standing in front of me tonight is different enough from the person I divorced that the question isn't simple. And I've learned to treat questions that aren't simple with the seriousness they deserve, rather than answering them quickly to relieve the discomfort." "That sounds like a no that might not be a permanent no." "It sounds like what it is," she said. "An honest position." He held her gaze for a moment and then nodded, with the quality of a man accepting terms he didn't set. Not defeated, but genuinely respectful of the boundary. "I'll take that," he said. He left an hour later before the evening wound down. She watched him go from across the room. He said goodbye to Marcus on his way out, which she also noted, and which told her something about the version of himself he was trying to inhabit. He did not look for her before he left, which was the right call. The evening continued and she returned to it fully, which was the correct response to the evening. It was her night, her work, and the people in the room deserved her presence. She moved through the remaining hours with the whole of her attention, and the conversations were good, and the light in the central installation completed its cycle twice more, and by the time the last guests were trickling out past midnight, the space held a quality she had been hoping for and hadn't been certain of achieving. It felt inhabited rather than merely occupied. The work had been lived in, if only for one evening. Marcus helped her close up. They turned off the track lighting in stages and let the installation light run through its final cycle in the near-empty space, and she stood in it for a few minutes while it moved from cold through warm into that indescribable amber gold that Priya had found, and let herself have the feeling of it. Not triumph exactly, not satisfaction of the simple kind, but something closer to arrival. The recognition of having come a long distance and being, at this particular moment, exactly where she was supposed to be. "How are you doing?" Marcus said. "Ask me that in the morning," she said. "Tonight I just want to be here." He understood this without requiring it to be explained, which was one of the reasons she valued him. She drove home through the city after midnight, through the streets that were quiet, in the particular way of a city that has not gone to sleep but is resting between its activities. She was tired in a way that was almost pleasant. The tiredness of a completed thing, rather than an ongoing effort. She had put everything she had into this show for the better part of 6 months, and it had opened, and it had been real, and now it existed in the world, and the making of it was finished. At a red light on Folsom Street, she thought about Ethan, the conversation, the question he'd asked, the answer she'd given. She turned it over without trying to resolve it, the way she had learned to turn over things that required more than one feeling. Here was the truth she had been sitting with since December, since she had taken his letter out of the drawer for the 10th time and read it in the early morning, and then sat with her coffee for a long time after. The anger had moved through her, not dissolved. It had been real, and she had not been willing to perform its resolution before it was genuine. But grief moved in its own time, and did not consult your preferences about when it was finished, and somewhere in the late fall, in the long mornings of making the new work, and the evenings of sitting with Grace over investment data, and the Sunday calls with her mother, the anger had become something else. Not forgiveness as an event, as a decision made on a particular afternoon. More like a gradual loosening of something that had been held very tightly over a long time, because holding it had been necessary. She was not the person who had stood in bare feet on a cold marble floor and heard her marriage end. She was not the person who had sat alone in a sterile condo and first opened a tablet she hadn't touched in 3 years. She was something past both of those people, further along a line that did not have a visible end, which was not a frightening quality, but an interesting one. She had no interest in rebuilding what had been. What had been was a life she had organized around someone else's needs and ambitions, and she had done it with genuine love and genuine commitment, and it had still, eventually, broken in ways she had not been able to prevent. That was its own kind of truth, and she held it without softening it. What she was interested in was what came next. Not with Ethan specifically. That question remained genuinely open in a way she had no interest in collapsing prematurely, but in the larger sense. The work,
which was only getting more interesting as she moved further into the territory she was building.
The Ironvale partnership and the investment positions, which were beginning to cohere into something that looked increasingly like an actual enterprise with its own logic and momentum. The people who were actually in her life, her mother, Marcus, Dana, Priya, Sophia, Grace, a small number, carefully chosen, genuinely present. The red light changed. She drove. There is something that the story of Lillian Brooks demands you sit with, if you let yourself. We tell a version of this story all the time. The woman discarded, the woman who rebuilds, the woman who proves her worth to the man who undervalued her. We tell it because it is satisfying, because it has the shape of justice, because it reassures us that the universe tracks these things and eventually corrects them. But that version flattens what actually happened, and what actually happened is more human and more difficult and more instructive. Lillian did not rebuild to prove something to Ethan. She rebuilt because the alternative, remaining in the reduced version of herself that the marriage had gradually produced, was not survivable. Not in any dramatic sense. She was not a woman in crisis the way people imagine crisis. She was a woman who had looked at herself clearly, for possibly the first time in years, and found that the person looking back was smaller than the person she knew herself to be, and that this smallness was fixable, and that fixing it required doing the thing that was hardest. The work was not therapy. The work was work, demanding, technical, formally rigorous, produced in real conditions by a person with real skill who had spent years not using it. Its emotional truth was inseparable from its formal quality, which is how real art works, and why the audience found it so quickly. People recognize the evidence of genuine effort made under genuine conditions. They always do. The money was not freedom. The settlement had been capital, and capital was inert without the intelligence and discipline to deploy it, which she had developed over a decade of watching it move in someone else's hands, and had simply never been given occasion to use on her own behalf. The money became freedom when she decided what to do with it, and then did that. Without a committee, without permission. And Ethan is the most complicated part of the story because he is neither a monster nor a man who simply made mistakes. He is a person who organized his life around achievement and in doing so treated the people nearest to him as infrastructure, as background to the achievement rather than as the point of it. And then he had the luck or the misfortune, depending on how you look at it, of having that choice returned to him in a form he could not deny. The woman he had discarded built something extraordinary. The relationship he had abandoned his marriage for turned out to be a construction. He was left with the company he had built, which was real, and the life he had built around himself, which was sparse in a way that had nothing to do with furniture. Whether he and Lillian find their way back to each other is a question the story declines to answer definitively, because real life declines to answer it. What can be said is that the versions of themselves that would have to meet are not the same versions who stood in a Marin County living room in March and ended something. The distance between those two versions, in both directions, is the actual content of the story. A month after the opening, Lillian flew to Chicago for a meeting with the curator who had hosted the first installation show. They were discussing a second run, larger, with a new body of work that she was already beginning to see the shape of. Not clearly, not in detail, but in the way that the next thing announces itself when the current thing has been fully delivered. On the flight back, she had a window seat and the sky was doing something extraordinary. A late afternoon in early May, with the cloud cover below the plane breaking apart into irregular formations lit from above by horizontal light that turned them every shade of amber and gold. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about what she would make when she got home. She thought about the drawer in the drafting table where the letter still lived and the question it represented that she had not yet answered. And she thought about how it was possible to hold an open question without urgency, to let it exist in the drawer of your life without forcing it closed before the time was right. She thought about her mother's voice on the phone, saying that sounds like you got yourself back, and about the slight inaccuracy of that, because the woman she was now was not the woman she had been before the marriage, before the grief, before the long work of rebuilding from the actual ground. Getting yourself back implied returning to a prior state. What she had done was more difficult and more interesting than that. She had moved forward through the worst of it and come out on the other side as someone who had lived all of it. The joy of the early years, the slow erosion of the middle ones, the specific destruction of the ending, the long dark months of the condo, and the tablet, and the work that came from having nothing left to protect. All of that was hers. The whole of it. Not despite the pain, but including it. The plane descended through the clouds, and the bay came into view below. The bridges, the water, the city on its peninsula catching the last of the afternoon light. She had looked at this view from this altitude more times than she could count, and it had never, not once, been the same twice. She pressed her forehead briefly against the glass. She was home.